It's a very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kathryn Julian to the AfterWars series. She is currently a visiting lecturer in history at Maryville College, and in a very real sense, she's one of our own because she did her MA here, and then went on to University of Massachusetts. Her work has been supported by the Fulbright Program, the German Academic Exchange Service, and the UMass Graduate School. And her current book project, entitled The Mother Teresa of Halle, Catholics, Cloisters, and Charity in Socialism, examines the influence of religious orders in East Germany, a society that was ostensibly atheist. And her talk today is entitled Refugees and Catholic Relief Efforts in Postwar German Borderlands. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Vegas, so much for the opportunity to come speak about my work here. So this is something that I've been revising for my book project for the first chapter. So I welcome any feedback, comments, critiques that any of you may have today. So the winter of 1946 to 47 was one of the coldest years on record in Europe. And the nuns at the Priory of St. Gertrude in the village of Alexanderdorf, which is outside of Berlin, endured failed harvests, bitter cold, and overstretched resources for more than 200 wounded soldiers who were in their care and war refugees as well. Their private histories from this so-called hunger winter suggested desperation, particularly when the thermometer dropped below negative 24 degrees Celsius, that's around, I guess, negative 11 Fahrenheit. These temperatures not only made life miserable for them, but the cold also destroyed the priory's potato and vegetable crops that were intended to sustain the nuns, as well as the local communities that really relied on the priory. Like all of Europe, the priory had experienced coal shortages, fuel shortages since the end of the war. And by 1946, there was no fuel left to heat even their stoves to keep them warm. So the sisters demonstrated their ingenuity, and some of them are featured here in this image from the Abbey now. They demonstrated ingenuity by gathering large amounts of sawdust to heat their common areas. The nuns' famous sawdust oven, as it became known, may have helped them survive, but likely did very little to abate the bone-chilling cold when they woke up before dawn for prayer and work. Amid their own shortages during this time period, the nuns continued to offer bread and clothing to the flood of displaced families and orphans who arrived at their doorstep. Every day in the summer of 1945, 50 to 70 people waited at the entrance of the cloister, hoping to receive some sort of provision. In the post-war years, Europe was a continent of migrants, and Germany in ruins was the destination of some 12 million refugees and expellees. Survival in the borderlands between Silesia, which would become Poland, and Germany during these most frigid months was compounded by these fuel shortages, hunger, malnourishment, and lack of shelter for all of these 12 million people. These post-war hardships traversed political borders, as did this vast refugee population. Among ethnic Germans, millions of Catholics streamed into eastern parts of Germany after the war, resettling from Silesia, the Sudetenland, and areas in Hungary, too. And I have a map that shows the migrations of these people. So you can see here, many of them settled in the east, and many of them also migrated to western parts of Germany. The Soviet occupying forces in the east, between Germany and Poland, were really not equipped to care for these devastated post-war communities. Along with lay people, Catholic lay people, post-war displacement brought an influx of young men and women in religious orders. Many sisters and priests from Silesia and former East and West Prussia, which you can see on the map here, kind of where those are, sorry it's in German, came to East Germany, and they took over a lot of social services or helped with social services and ministerial care in rural communities. It was these minority religious actors, rather than a state bureaucracy, who led small-scale post-war relief efforts on the German-Polish border, thereby creating a stable community for these people in flux. So my talk today explores these post-war difficulties of recovery in the 1940s, but into the 1950s as well in East Germany. It centers specifically on the relief efforts of Catholic religious orders, namely the Benedictines, who were in Alexanderdorf, the Sisters of St. Elizabeth, who were the largest female order in East Germany, and they were dispersed all over, and the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. There were other orders as well, but these were the largest. I'll also highlight the challenges of establishing Catholicism within socialism. Nuns and priests created a bridge between these pre-war practices and the post-war that contributed to the cultural life of displaced people who would later become East German citizens, many of them. The story of migration, relief efforts, and war recovery is essential to understanding the continued existence and initial growth of Catholic religious orders in a society that was, for all intents and purposes, supposed to be atheist. They certainly promoted a secular worldview. Religious communities responded to this devastation of war by focusing on social services. They fed displaced people, they cared for war orphans, and they cared for the injured. Most of the orders had been doing this as part of their ordinary activities since the outbreak of war, so they continued in the post-war. Many nuns were old enough to remember serving in military hospitals during the First World War as well, and a few elderly Sisters of St. Elizabeth recalled serving in hospitals during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. They were probably in their 70s by this time, 70s or even 80s. In other words, Catholics in this area were accustomed to adversity. Their survival had long depended on their adaptability to times of crisis and to hostile authorities. Nuns, sisters especially, often made themselves indispensable to these secular authorities that were supposed to be hostile to them, or should have been, in their ministry to the elderly and to the sick, the marginalized, the displaced, practices that would continue after the Second World War. As visible representations of the Catholic Church, they're very visible, they don't hide, they're in their religious garb, their habits. People in religious vocations, like these nuns, were not strangers to an existence in opposition to secular authority. From the Protestant Reformation, they live in the heartland of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, to Bismarck's Kulturkampf, which targeted Catholic communities as a detriment to German nationhood in the 19th century, to the Nazi seizure of cloisters and landholdings. The lesson learned from these histories of persecution, coupled with support from international networks, provided Catholic orders with the resources to survive in post-1945 political order in Europe. In the absence of really strong governmental authority, Catholic institutes were well positioned to mobilize and provide relief to refugees that were displaced by war. Though often refugees themselves, men and women in religious orders were among the first to provide relief in the years following the war. So, to be sure, the image of a cloister seems somewhat anachronistic, the image of a cloister in socialism, behind the Iron Curtain. Some legacy to a distant medieval past. So what explains not only the existence of these institutions in this area within socialism, but also their direct involvement in socialist society after the war? And that's really a question that I think drives my entire project, and also is answered partially by what I'm talking about today. The foundation was really set in this post-war period. In the early post-war period, the Soviet military administration, which occupied this area, and then after 1949, the Socialist Unity Party, or the SED, that was the ruling party in the GDR, German Democratic Republic, East Germany, enacted relatively mild policies toward the churches in the East. Reports from regional cadres in this area in the late 40s and then in the 50s stated that religious involvement in society was even positive, particularly female work in soup kitchens and hospitals, health services. Unlike many of its Eastern Bloc counterparts, the East German state didn't ban monastic or religious orders in the GDR, much to the surprise sometimes of the religious orders living in the GDR, because the precedent certainly existed in other communist countries. And I think I have an archival image here. So to your left, those are sisters in Bulgaria who had to meet in private in order to practice their religion. And then on the right is a Czechoslovakian sister who was sent to forced labor. And she's still wearing her habit, but not allowed to live as a community, or in a community with her colleagues. Soviet republics such as Ukraine, too, saw young nuns as a strong and educated labor force and sent them to work in various industries, from farm labor to forestry. In Romania, nuns who refused to join Romanian Orthodox communities were disbanded, arrested, shot, or sent to labor camps in Siberia. Catholic orders in Soviet-annexed countries like Lithuania were threatened with imprisonment, while Eastern Bloc countries such as Hungary forbade the wearing of habits or religious vestment of any kind. Only in Poland, East Germany, and Yugoslavia did Catholic religious orders, have limited freedom to practice their belief through charitable ministries and pastoral care, so they could still be active in society in these three areas. One reason overtly repressive policies were not pursued in East Germany, despite the desire to create a secular communist state, was the need for Germans to distance themselves from the legacy of Nazism, which had waged a war on monastic and religious orders and went so far as to liquidate monasteries. They repurposed the land of cloisters and belonging to religious orders. And perhaps more important for the period I'm discussing today, the Soviet military administration's tolerance of religious institutes during the occupation was in large part due to the practical needs of the society rebuilding from the devastation of war. It was pragmatic for authorities to allow Catholic charities to share the burden of recovery, and congregations like the Sisters of St. Elizabeth had maintained health and social services throughout the war. After the war, they simply transformed what had primarily been used as military hospitals to institutions to care for refugee communities. The centrality of charity to the church's organization secured a certain independence for these institutions as a sort of provision until the socialist state could implement more systematic welfare. At least that was the idea of socialist officials. That's what they wrote in their documents. Because religious orders managed and maintained charitable institutions so efficiently, however, Catholic charity became a mainstay in socialist society rather than a stopgap. And the commitment of religious men and women to refugee communities laid the groundwork for a small but vibrant Catholic church in East Germany. The relationships religious communities cultivated with their Eastern Bloc neighbors, as well as with West German institutes during this time period, positioned them uniquely between opposing Cold War societies and allowed for a continued exchange between East and West, despite the Iron Curtain, the symbolic Iron Curtain. These relationships really came out of the shared experience of post-war scarcity and the generosity of sisters and priests in the borderlands. The flood of people fleeing conflict in the East, and then later Germans who were expelled, and I can go back to this to show you, who were expelled from the Sudetenland, East Prussia, and areas like that, placed a real strain on communities already struggling with their own subsistence. Because of massive Soviet reparations, requisitioned in the form of surplus harvest, fuel, and equipment, the Soviet occupation zone suffered more acutely than other parts of Europe in the first few years after the war. In 1945, Soviet soldiers near Alexanderdorf, for example, took vehicles. They uprooted fruit-bearing trees at the priory, and then in the autumn, they just requisitioned the priory's small beef herd that it had, without asking, of course. The lack of proper nutrition would continue then to be an issue for these communities into the 1950s as a result of rationing and levies imposed even by the East German state, really until 1956 or so. Catholic orders in other areas of Eastern Germany also felt the strain of new refugee communities, evidenced by letters and records that continually lamented their inability to properly manage and care for the people who came to their doors. And here this is a map, I don't know that you can see it that well, this is a map I created of, I created the little blue cross marks, and these are some of the major Catholic institutions that I'll talk about. You can see Berlin, there's some in Halle. Two of the hospitals I'll be talking about are listed here. In September 1946, one sister of St. Elizabeth in Halle, on the map here, predicted the difficult winter that lay ahead and described the scarcity of foodstuffs resulting from the dry harvest. Each family under their care was allotted only a small portion of potatoes, and people in the city had already started to bring family members and children to the hospital in hopes that somehow the sisters could better care for their children, provide them some sort of nourishment that they weren't getting. So the lack of adequate supplies is especially disheartening for communities like the Sisters of St. Elizabeth, who ran hospitals and kindergartens, and they just couldn't provide for the people who came to them. The turbulent years of Nazism and then the post-war recovery were also particularly devastating to the eastern province of Jesuits. Many found their way to Berlin and Dresden from the lost territories of Prussia and Silesia, with news of deaths, hunger, and atrocity in the east. The province had already lost 2 novitiates, a retreat center, and a seminary to the National Socialists, who had also forcefully conscripted young priests into military service in the Wehrmacht, and sent 2 Jesuits from the eastern province to Dachau, the concentration camp. The Gestapo also arrested 4 more Jesuit brothers in 1944, and then after the war was over, Soviet forces burned the Jesuit province house in Königsberg. Firebombing from the Allies, so they're getting it from all sides, firebombing from the Allies destroyed their institutes in Dresden and Leipzig, but the priests were determined to remain in the East and rebuild, especially as refugees continued to arrive at their doorstep. So these congregations continued to serve as a foundation for the church in East Germany during a period of political and economic uncertainty. Just 2 years after the war, the Sisters of St. Elizabeth had reestablished their hospital ministry as well as orphanages, soup kitchens, and retirement homes in Eastern Germany long before secular authorities established any of these social services. Finally, in 1947, everyday religious rituals, prayer, and celebration of the Eucharist, and even their mundane routines resumed as well. On the Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin in 1947, for instance, the Grey Sisters, as they were known, Sisters of St. Elizabeth in Halle, clothed 12 new novices and elected a new superior. So it appeared they were returning to business as usual. And this is an image of the profession of vows during this time period. And so you can see that the number was really quite substantial and surprising in the East. Many sisters from the East took over social services and ministerial care in rural communities. The Jesuits' diaspora mission, St. Francis Xavier outside of Dresden, received 4 priests and 4 brothers in addition to 12 lay refugees in 1946. And that same year, the Grey Sisters, who ran a retirement home in the small village of Utsdorf, north of Berlin, welcomed 3 sisters who were expellees from Danzig, now Dansk, in Poland. These younger women and men helped mitigate the growing population of elderly sisters in the Soviet zone and aided in pastoral care for the surrounding communities. And remarkably, despite all of these hardships, these young women stayed in the East. So it might have seemed natural at this time, and this was often a question, for members of orders to join Catholics who were trickling through the border in the 1940s and 1950s to settle in the West. Certainly West Germany offered a future without the risk of persecution. Regions like Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg were very Catholic, and they still boasted wealthy monasteries and well-funded orders. So it's significant that the majority of religious sisters, brothers, and priests stayed in the East, even when many lay Catholics tried to migrate west. In fact, church officials actively encouraged those in vocations to remain in East Germany. Bishop Otto Spulbeck of Dresden-Meißen made it his mission to minister to and organize the Catholic refugee communities from Eastern Prussia and the Danube regions of Western Hungary. That was kind of his mission in the post-war period. And most people in religious vocations shared his convictions. In letters and sermons, he urged priests and nuns to remain in the East. Afraid that Catholics might flee the area altogether, he petitioned the congregations in Rome for supplies and financial aid for priests who had to travel long distances to administer critical sacraments like baptism to the evacuated and displaced. Donations from international Catholic organizations ensured that Catholic communities settled and survived the post-war period in the Soviet occupation zone and then in East Germany. The Jesuits near Dresden also made it their mission to ensure the survival of a Catholic community in the East. For the Jesuits, relief donations from the West, this is very Jesuit, often came in the form of books. They were very focused on education. The war had caused a rupture in education, regular attendance at Mass, and administration of the sacraments. Many young children had never been baptized nor catechized, something that the Jesuit mission among refugees intended to remedy. One priest near Dresden reported that the people's, quote, poverty aggravated an already desperate situation in which they felt isolated and dispersed, end quote. So in response, a lot of Western Jesuits financed village ministries and seminars in the East by helping pay for transportation. They sent Jesuits mopeds to minister to these remote villages. And they sent religious histories and theological readings, which would later land these priests in trouble with secular authorities in East Germany. Despite the cramped and freezing conditions near Dresden, the Jesuits too had no materials for heat. They slept 6 to a room. The priests continued to educate area children who had not had theological teaching in more than 3 years. One priest reported on a miserable trip to a village a few days' journey from Erfurt for a children's seminar. He waited in the bitter cold for 2 hours at the train station. The train ride, which was not heated either, took 6 hours, and when he finally arrived in this village, he had to walk 14 kilometers through a wintry forest to the home of a Protestant pastor who shared his hearth with the weary priest. But these hardships didn't deter the Jesuits' mission in the refugee communities in Germany. At the end of this report, actually, this particular priest celebrated the Children's Week as a complete success, which he kind of took credit for. Which, he had to walk 6 or 12 kilometers through a wintry forest, so we'll let him take credit for that. But such accounts must have been really heartening for the Jesuit hierarchy, since in 1948 they sent more priests into the eastern areas to care for the souls of displaced Catholics. They described their mission in the Soviet zone as a necessary duty and hardship, the same rhetoric used in their discourses during this time about their missions in China and in Cuba. The German Jesuits then viewed the Protestant and increasingly secular East as a foreign mission field. In 1947, a priest in Hoheneichen, this is outside of Dresden, described enthusiastically in a letter to Rome the change that had occurred in communities in the East since the immediate post-war. Where once these people felt as unwelcome foreigners, now, he claimed, the people expressed contentment in their new home, and they seemed grateful to finally accept the help of the Jesuits and other orders. This intense missionary focus, however, I should say, would later bring the Jesuits into direct conflict with state authorities. The only public trial for or against religious Catholic orders in East Germany was against Jesuits in the 1950s, and they were arrested and sent to prison. And it also severely curtailed the influence that Jesuits themselves could directly have in East German society. The charities of female congregations, on the other hand, were not met with the same hostility, and they were even more widespread than their male counterparts. There were more of them, too. And they helped countless refugees adjust to life in Germany. They were in almost every region of East Germany. The nuns at Halle's, St. Barbara's, and St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and at Dresden's St. Joseph's Hospital, stayed committed in their work, even as they lost a lot of medical professionals to the West. A lot of doctors fled during this time period. The loss of important personnel, in their view, made the continuance of their work in hospitals all the more essential. Because of their work in healthcare and hospitals in particular, the Sisters of St. Elizabeth were vital to the creation of Catholic identity and Catholic community in East Germany. Because they were important to the state, they could negotiate a little bit. In the East German area of Thuringia, there were 935 sisters who operated 40 retirement homes, 13 hospitals, 11 children's homes, 3 institutes for feeding and housing displaced persons and expellees, 9 community homes, 82 preschools, this is right in the post-war period, and 4 nurseries for children. Sisters were able to more easily continue this type of work unimpeded than their male counterparts. This was partially due to the fact that most Catholic congregations in East Germany were not overtly political. Their correspondences from these early years centered on healing from the aftermath of war and everyday rituals rather than any kind of political action or ideology. In fact, the majority of East German Catholic private records throughout the duration of socialism contain little political rhetoric. The relative absence of political discussion from early chronicles, histories, and correspondences did not necessarily indicate ignorance or apathy, but rather revealed that recovery, first of all, occupied the attention of orders in post-war Europe. Silence on political issues likewise reflected prior experience with state bureaucracy. Nuns in Eastern Germany recognized that negotiation with, not opposition to, secular authorities was central to their survival. Lessons learned in periods starting even with the Reformation. So their ability to negotiate and to adapt allowed opportunities to create a form of Catholic associational life in East Germany. And preserve distinct traditions, Catholic traditions, within socialism. Refugees, after all, brought with them a variety of cultural and devotional practices, and religious congregations worked to preserve the specific cultures of the displaced Germans that came into their care. Even as some migrants continued on to West Germany, around 700,000 people from the Eastern Territories came to dioceses like Dresden. And many more settled in the predominantly Catholic Eichsfeld region. There's, if you can see it there, it's somewhat near Erfurt. It was the only Catholic enclave in East Germany. These refugees arriving in the Eastern occupation zone were predominantly Catholic, and they did create somewhat of a strain on the church in these places as it tried to accommodate an expanding number of parishioners who needed aid and access to sacraments. Some church officials referred to the Catholic Church during this period as, quote, the refugee church in atheist lands, end quote. The Catholic churches in the East and West formed committees and collections to help German expellees preserve their culture, to preserve the culture of the displaced Sudeten Germans, for instance. There was even a work team for Salesian songs and music, which they used a lot of music and cultural activities. I have an image from the Grey Sisters in Dresden at their hospital performing for families there as well. Catholic orders like the Sisters of St. Elizabeth and the Jesuits outside of Dresden co-hosted a number of events and workshops with national Catholic groups, including the Breslau Catholics and Ukrainian and Latvian communities. Priests and Jesuit brothers also participated in a grassroots organization called the Ackerman Community, which was formed by Catholic expellees from the Sudetenland to maintain their culture and community in foreign lands, what they considered foreign lands. These groups often consisted of lay people, priests, and members of orders. A number of Jesuits were also involved in St. Hedwig's People's Mission, Volksmission, to help resettle expellees and to give them homes in this area. Though many of these grassroots associations were based in the West, Catholic institutes in the East also tried to create a community for refugees, often through music associations and community events, like you see here. In 1947, the Priory of St. Gertrude also contributed to this. They began to host annual family retreats and camps for children who had been relocated due to the war. And this is a picture of the Benedictines from around 1950. And I also have a picture of some of these family retreats from the early 1950s here. Convents then, like the Priory, served as sites that offered a sense of protection and shelter for Catholics in the tumultuous years following the war. Young people often stayed in St. Gertrude's Priory's barn for special holidays and festivals, and the Benedictine sisters opened their chapel for ecumenical services and prayer, as there were few places in post-war era to hold church-related events. So they let in Protestants. There were even some Muslim POWs that they worshipped with in their chapel. So they were very ecumenical in this time period. Devout women in particular spent time at the cloister for retreat and prayer, while Catholic families from Berlin and Erfurt visited for long weekends, high holidays, Christmas festivities. Beginning after the war, the Priory became a central feature for village life in the Mark-Brandenburg area, and it became an important gathering place for East German Catholics and later Polish and other Eastern Bloc Catholics that could venture there. The solidarity centered on the convent created what the nuns called a familial character, nurtured by a range of Catholic guests, from families to workers from the community surrounding the Priory, to sisters from other Eastern Bloc countries that were able to travel there even in the 1950s. For these women from places like Bulgaria and Lithuania, St. Gertrude was a shelter where they could for the first time live freely as nuns, to wear their habits in public. The tiny village of Alexanderdorf remained a destination for Catholics in Berlin and Brandenburg. For the East German devout, it became a quasi-sacred space where families and individuals could escape the sense of being an outsider, being isolated in socialist society. Seminars and retreats established social networks centered on experiences at the convent and ensured that it remained a focal point for local communities. In 1984, St. Gertrude became the first female Benedictine abbey in the region since the Reformation in 1517, so it is really kind of a symbol in this area. Far from being an isolated community, as we often think of cloistered nuns, these nuns were considered a vital part of rural society near Alexanderdorf. They had treated Soviet soldiers after the war, they provided work for people in neighboring villages, and they welcomed Protestants and Catholics into their chapel for worship. The willingness of religious orders like the Benedictines to interact with and aid a diversity of people helped them survive and negotiate difficult and often unpredictable politics in the GDR. Their frequent contact with a range of people, from Polish sisters to communist cadres to Hungarian priests who came to visit, also created a distinct identity for Catholic orders living in socialism. So to kind of conclude all of this, Catholics remained connected to pre-war culture and the culture of Eastern refugees, due in large part to the leadership of religious congregations who chose to stay in the East while many fled West. So women like, I have featured here, Sister Modesta, devoted their entire lives to helping people in Halle. She was born in 1903. She lived through the First World War. She became a Sister of St. Elizabeth and was active in the hospitals during the Second World War and post-war recovery. And she became a beloved figure in socialism. Everyone in Halle recognized her. They called her the sister with the two bags. And then later they called her the Mother Teresa of Halle because she was so well known in the community. Members of Catholic orders learned to maneuver around socialist dictates, but their focus remained on continuing church ministries and preserving a Catholic way of life, which would have been impossible had the church revolted against socialist authority, or publicly revolted against socialist authority. As the Archbishop of Berlin once said, one should not pull the lion's tail if one is sitting in the cage with him. And they certainly took that to heart. So these tactics of negotiation and adaptation proved to be a pretty effective strategy for them, for it allowed religious congregations to keep the doors of their institutions open through 40 years plus of socialism. This is the inauguration, or the consecration, I should say, of new equipment that had come from the West in the 1960s in St. Joseph's Hospital in Dresden. And you can see they're celebrating with champagne. There's a doctor smoking in the operating room. It was a different time. But they were able to keep their institutions open like this. And as a result of transnational exchanges in the immediate post-war period, nuns in East Germany and Poland continued dialogue with each other. When possible, they even traveled between East Germany and Poland for pilgrimages and seminars. The Sisters of St. Elizabeth in particular continued active social services during 40 years of socialism and beyond. East German authorities really underestimated this type of commitment and the extent to which religious orders were involved in rebuilding the post-war Catholic community. Instead of fading into the obscurity of some feudal past, as socialist officials hoped they would, confessional establishments became centers of devotion and discourse that were set apart from the political and ideological constraints of socialist society. At the heart of post-war vocational life was the desire to serve others. And in the 1940s, those people were refugees and expellees. In 21st century Europe, the post-war legacy of aiding refugees displaced by conflict remains central to the mission of women like the Sisters of St. Elizabeth, who recall their own histories of adversity. So here, this is their current campaign in Halle at the hospital. So this says, "We've always worn a headscarf. Here, everyone is treated equally. Initiative, foreign friend." And this, at least 2 years ago, this was on the front of their hospital in Halle. Foreign friends, refugees, welcome. So, thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to hearing your comments and feedback.
So in German, there's a word that's hard to translate into English precisely, but Erwartungshorizonte, or horizons of expectation, as a way of describing when a person undertakes actions, what's their expectation of what the future is going to look like? And I wonder whether your reading of the sources leaves you exclusively with a picture of a community that's just keeping its head down, or whether there's an expectation of change, of liberalization, of reunification at some distant point. What can you tell us about the sort of intellect, the interior lives vis-a-vis the future of the people you've described?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think the Catholic Church, and I understand why it's often categorized by historians and scholars as the church in silence in East Germany and socialism, and this kind of perception that they just kept their head down and went about their business. And I understand that because they did know how to negotiate and adapt, and in a way stay out of trouble sometimes so they could continue their ministries. But I think to some extent that is an unfair characterization of the kind of pluralist mission that these people had, and the vision of the Catholic Church in East Germany. And I think they did have expectations and hopes for the future. And I think part of that was reunification, maybe not in the way that it happened. I don't think they envisioned it in that way. But as a global church, they are always thinking about, and even in the sources you see this, even if it's not a direct political critique, they're thinking about reunifying with their West German counterparts, being able to travel more. And they are certainly always concerned about the future of the church in East Germany. They do settle in a bit more in the 70s and 80s, and they're able to travel more. But you see in those documents hopes that they can expand within socialism too. And some of them see themselves as developing within socialism. They are the church within socialism, and they're ministering to this strong East German Catholic community. One thing, though, that differentiates Catholics from Protestants during this period is the Protestant church in Germany was divided between East and West. Catholics maintained unity in their diocese and everything, their hierarchy. So a lot of their mother houses, a lot of their seats were in the West. St. Hedwig's in Berlin was actually in the East, so Western people couldn't cross over the border until much later. But yeah, I think they do have aspirations. The church will expand and in a way that's maybe a little more subtle than you see with Protestants that protest in the 1980s outright. If that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if you could speak more to the specific groups that you chose and maybe the archives that you visited.
Yeah, so it's always difficult to figure out, to kind of narrow it down. So my book looks at more groups than just the Benedictines and the Jesuits and the Sisters of St. Elizabeth. But it does focus largely on the Sisters of St. Elizabeth because they were the largest female order and they do traverse these borders. They were founded in what is now Poland, in Nysa at the time, in the 19th century. And so they're in both countries and still fairly active in Germany today. And I was talking to Veas a little bit before this about how archival sources we have access to often determine what we end up writing about, and that is very much the case here. The Sisters of St. Elizabeth in Berlin have an incredible archivist, Herr Mertens, Mr. Mertens, Johannes Mertens, who's written about them as well. And he has organized extraordinary resources in a way that you don't find at other little small archives of Catholic orders, or not a lot. The Jesuits, of course, have a huge archive in Munich as well. But he was very kind and gracious, and I spent a lot of my time researching there. And so as a result, they became a really big emphasis of this project. I also stayed with the Benedictines in Alexanderdorf for a week, and so I focused on them as kind of my example of cloistered nuns and orders during this period. Although there were two other big cloisters and abbeys in East Germany, the Cistercians, that were medieval and survived through that time period. And I reached out to them and visited, but they told me they didn't have archival sources. So the Benedictines it was.
So with the expellees, I mean, I imagine a lot of them, just based off of northern Germany prior to the expellation, they're prominently Protestant, and the expellees are coming from Catholic parts of Europe.
Right.
Are they, and I know that they're Catholic orders, but are they being treated within the source material as a separate group of Germans, if that makes sense? Like, is there negative or positive language being utilized within, when referring to these communities compared to kind of the local, like, historical connection that these nunnery or the orders had?
Right. Yeah, that's a great connection. Question. And from the Catholic sources and that perspective, I don't see negative language. They, beyond just we're all overstretched during this time period, but a lot of them welcomed these Catholic refugees into their midst, and hoped, and again, to speak to their aspirations, hoped that they would become kind of a stronghold of Catholicism, again, in a state that they realized, or in an area they realized was going to become socialist. From the expellees themselves, there is a sense that they are isolated and ostracized, and I did read some sources from West Germany, which isn't the focus of my project, but in West Germany, a lot of them felt even more isolated. Their dialects were very different. There hadn't been as much exchange between Western German communities and these people in East Prussia, as there had been in the East. And so there I see a little bit more negativity, negative rhetoric, but they were eventually all able to assimilate for the most part.
Does having this religious identity on the part of Catholics and of Protestants in East Germany, would you see it as encouraging ecumenical ventures at times in surprising ways, or is that lacking?
I do see that. Especially in the later periods, there were also Protestant nuns in eastern parts of Germany, and they often hold seminars with their Catholic counterparts, and they are fewer in number even than the Catholic religious orders, and they're Lutheran nuns, and they also take vows, and they maintained a lot of the same social services that Catholic nuns, sisters did. For example, care for the mentally ill. The state didn't really want to, or at least that wasn't a central concern of theirs, the elderly and the mentally disabled. And so they gladly kind of let Catholic orders and confessional institutions take over. And so there are a lot of practical seminars and training experiences that where you see ecumenical exchange in that period, and to a certain extent in small villages, especially like in Alexanderdorf, you see a lot of ecumenical exchange with Protestant communities. That area is primarily Protestant, but they really valued the presence of this abbey and were kind of proud of it in a way, and even as it became more and more secular. So you see those exchanges, I think, especially in rural areas rather than in the cities.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions, or maybe one question that's two parts about state interference.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned at one point, I guess the shorter of the two parts, that the female orders experience less state interference than those populated by men. I'm curious why that is. And then second, you also mentioned that state interference within these organizations was much more limited in the early part of your history, primarily because they needed people to help. And then you mentioned just a moment ago that there were some areas like helping with certain population groups that the state had no interest in, that they were free to let that go over. But how did state interference more broadly increase and or change over the course of your period?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So it is a very gendered treatment of religious orders. The rhetoric, when you're looking at these state documents from the state secretary for religious questions, is very gendered. They view the male orders, especially the Jesuits, as being threatening, as Jesuits are often viewed by, and before this period even, by political authorities as being kind of a threatening element. They call them NATO spies in their documents, that they're these, kind of aggressors come to spread the Pope's imperialism, and they can never be loyal here. And that's why they end up targeting a lot of these mail orders and priests. And another reason I think for that is because the church itself at the time is very patriarchal. This is before the Second Vatican Council even, when there's more participation. And there is this notion with secular authorities too that priests are going to have more influence over parishioners to help, smuggle in Western things or tracts or education, or help them smuggle to the West. And that's what they end up trying these 4 Jesuits for, and imprisoning them for things like having religious tracts or riding around a Western moped. So the women, the female orders, they let get away with things that are pretty surprising, like large-scale pilgrimages, even in the 1950s, when the socialist state is more repressive in the 50s, because it's really trying to establish this atheist state. And one of the documents that I remember reading talks about a Children's Week, and it's this huge pilgrimage that ends it. It's led by a lot of nuns and sisters, and the cadre, whoever was writing it, his name wasn't on there, actually writes, we approved it because it's just a bunch of women and children. I mean, that was actually the rhetoric used. So it's pretty apparent that the state themselves have a very gendered treatment of these different elements. And I looked at the Stasi files as well, and there aren't many on nuns that tracked nuns and sisters. Mother Teresa has a file when she visits, of course, like outside foreign elements. And then the second part of your question, the 1950s became pretty repressive for churches, so especially anything centered on youth and youth education becomes a point of contention. And so the state does shut down schools, parochial schools, although one remains in East Berlin the entire time. It's a school for girls run by nuns. So all kind of secondary schools are shut down, but they're able to keep kindergartens, retirement homes, hospitals were very important. And in fact, the only religious type of education past preschool age that people could receive was medical health services. And so those remained Catholic, or there were a few that were Catholic in East Germany. And then after the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the state relaxes a little bit and kind of realizes, all right, well, these orders are kind of here to stay, even though they're alarmed at how they grow in the 50s and 60s. So their numbers really grow during that period.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
just as a
Yeah.
follow-up,
Yeah.
is there any evidence that you can find that suggests that the actual... So the government viewed the work being done by mail orders versus female orders as being significantly different, with mail orders being more threatening. Is that just because the government has this view, or is there actual evidence that the Jesuits, for example, were actually performing work that, from an objective perspective,
Yes.
could be seen as subversive to the socialist state,
Yes.
whereas the female orders were not performing, or performing less of that work?
Right. Yes. Yeah. I think that's a really good point and a good distinction to make. That yeah. I mean, we can understand why the state goes after Jesuits, because they are educating young people. In Leipzig, they had like a seminar for youth in the community. They did have religious tracts from the West. They still, especially in the 50s, they're still traversing the border. And there is some evidence that they were helping families cross the border into West Berlin, or at least in one instance. But it's hard to say because a lot of this was under interrogation. So, but yeah, I mean, certainly, and the mail orders aren't as involved in healthcare or retirement homes. They are administering sacraments. They are taking confession. They're baptizing. So yeah, from that perspective, you can see that their work does, to a secular atheist state, does seem more threatening than sisters who are running a hospital that admits even party functionaries. This is a little anecdotal, but and this is also from the sisters themselves. They told me that during their time in Halle, in this hospital, whenever any kind of Soviet dignitary or administrator was there, their wives always requested to be treated by the nuns, because there was this perception that they would receive better care or something from religious orders and Catholic hospitals. So they remained somewhat valuable and maybe also a little bit exotic in the GDR.
Elizabeth, can I give you the last question?
Yes, of course. Where are the resources coming to keep these things going? So you mentioned the West,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
if people are starving and they're showing up
Mhm.
wanting food, where is this food? You know, if all their potatoes have gone, like, where are these resources coming from, and who is administrating them? Which is kind of a two-part. Is it the people on the ground administrating it, or is there some oversight group?
Yes.
I wonder if it's male in the sense that you have these female organizations, that kind of stuff. That may also be gendered.
That's a great question. And I need to I think make that more clear in this chapter too, because where the resources are coming from is a really big part of this story, and they're coming from the West, even in this earlier period, but especially once you get into the late 40s and then the 50s. The West, of course, is being injected with money from the Marshall Plan, from the United States. And then Catholic orders, their counterparts in the West, are sending hard currency, which the East German state allows because it is an injection into their economy. Although there's lip service to like, oh, we don't need this imperialist, but they allow it throughout the duration of the GDR. And they're also sending goods. And so a lot of the sisters and orders live a little bit better than some of the regular East Germans, because they get telephones before other people, and if they're running a hospital, that's allowed. And so who's it being administered by? Catholic charities a lot of times. Caritas had a branch in East Germany. It's a big international Catholic charity, and they administer the majority of charitable resources that came into East Germany from Rome and from West Germany.
And then
Primarily
allotted
West
it out
Germany.
to the different groups.
Well, a lot of times they would, but sometimes it would be specific. So, like the Sisters of St. Elizabeth, they had a mother house in Hamburg, and so those donations would come directly from their mother house to them, and so they could write letters and petition and request. And a lot of the times it was a male church hierarchy that had to petition on behalf of the sisters. So the majority of documents I read are bishops and priests, but primarily bishops, petitioning state authorities for sisters or whoever to be able to travel, or petitioning somebody in Cologne to send them goods. So it is very hierarchical. It's pluralist on the ground, and the ministries are kind of pluralist, and the way they practice devotion in East Germany. But then the implementation is pretty hierarchical still. Yeah.
We so appreciate this fascinating talk, and please join me in thanking Dr. Julian.